The soft glow of the evening lights bathed Hannah Parker's face as she walked through the bustling streets of downtown Boston, the cool air brushing against her skin. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was. Her beige cardigan wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, and her well-worn sneakers whispered comfort rather than extravagance. She never imagined that her choice of attire would determine how she was treated tonight. This night wasn't meant to be anything grand. It was simply a step in preparing a surprise for her husband, Michael. Their anniversary was approaching, and she had decided to book a table at the Crystal Palace, the city's most exclusive fine dining restaurant. It was a place that held deep sentimental value for both of them. The very place where Michael, then a young and ambitious engineer, had taken her on their first date. Back then, he was full of dreams, and she was teaching art at the local community center, both of them envisioning a future together. Now he was a renowned tech innovator, tirelessly working to launch his new sustainable energy platform. She wanted to celebrate how far they had come. She glanced at her watch. Perfect timing. Her weekly pottery class had just ended, and she had stopped by the restaurant on her way home. A faint smudge of clay still lingered beneath her fingernails, a small remnant of the passion that had always been a part of her. The reservation was for next week. Tonight, she simply wanted to secure it in person, knowing how impossible it was to get a table at such a coveted place. As she neared the restaurant, its grand exterior loomed before her, golden lights spilling onto the sidewalk. Through its tall windows, she could see the chandeliers glistening above pristine white tablecloths, where Boston's elite sat in elegant attire, indulging in their luxurious meals. She took a deep breath, pushing open the heavy glass door. Inside, she was immediately met with the scrutinizing gaze of a woman at the host stand. The maître d', Victoria, was impeccably dressed in a sharp black suit, her presence exuding sophistication. Her eyes swept over Hannah's casual clothing, and in an instant, her expression cooled. "Good evening," Hannah said warmly, offering a polite smile. "I'd like to make a reservation for next Friday, if possible." Victoria's posture remained composed, but her voice carried a hint of restrained condescension. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the next 3 months, madam." Hannah's smile didn't falter. "I understand how busy you must be. It's for a very special anniversary. This restaurant means a great deal to my husband and me." Before Victoria could respond, a man in an expensive suit strode up to the host stand, exuding the kind of arrogance that demanded attention. Hannah instantly recognized him. Richard Hammond, a real estate mogul notorious for his lavish lifestyle and his presence in Boston's social pages. "Victoria," he barked, barely sparing Hannah a glance, "my usual table isn't set up properly, and where is my bottle of 82 Bordeaux? I specifically requested it." "Right away, Mr. Hammond," Victoria said smoothly, her demeanor shifting into something more deferential. Only then did Hammond finally look at Hannah, his gaze making a brief dismissive sweep over her attire. He leaned in slightly toward Victoria, his voice carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "I thought this establishment had standard," he muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. "Since when do we let just anyone stroll in off the street?" Victoria cleared her throat, her discomfort barely visible beneath her mask of professionalism. "Sir, I was just explaining that we're fully booked." Hannah felt heat creep up her neck, but she refused to let the humiliation show. Keeping her voice even, she turned back to Victoria. "As I was saying, I'd like to make a reservation for next week. Perhaps I could speak with the manager about any openings?" Hammond scoffed, turning to her directly. "Listen, lady, this isn't some corner diner. People wait months for a table here, and they dress accordingly." His gaze flicked to her clay-streaked jeans, his disapproval clear. Hannah lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand the prestige of this place, sir. I'm not asking to be seated tonight. I simply want to secure a reservation. Hammond shook his head, clearly uninterested in hearing another word. Victoria, please deal with this. My guests are waiting. And with that, he turned on his heel, disappearing into the dining room. Hannah exhaled, steadying herself. She was painfully aware of the eyes on her now, whispers curling through the air like invisible daggers. Some diners watched with barely concealed amusement, others with blatant disapproval. Still, she refused to let this moment break her. I apologize for the interruption, she said, her voice calm but firm. Now, about the reservation, Victoria cut her off with a polite but empty smile. Perhaps I wasn't clear, madam. We simply don't have availability. Hannah's fingers tightened around her purse, but she refused to let frustration take hold. Instead, she reached inside, pulling out her wallet. I completely understand that this is an exclusive establishment. I'd be happy to place a deposit if that would help secure a table. Victoria's hand lifted in a subtle yet unmistakable gesture of dismissal. It's not about deposits, she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more pointed tone. The Crystal Palace caters to a particular clientele. We have standards to uphold. The words struck Hannah like a slap, their meaning sharp and deliberate. It wasn't about a reservation. It was about her. For the first time that evening, a wave of anger surged through her, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their worth. I see, she murmured, her voice quiet but laced with steel. So your standards are determined by looks rather than character? Victoria's expression hardened ever so slightly, though her practiced politeness never wavered. Madam, perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the bistros down the street. They're quite lovely and far more accommodating. From across the room, Hammond's smirk widened. Some people need to be told twice, apparently. Elaine took a step closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper, her tone shifting from dismissive to threatening. Madam, either you leave voluntarily or I'll be forced to have you escorted out. The disbelief in Hannah's chest coiled into something heavier. Anger, injustice, the sheer absurdity of it all. She inhaled sharply, forcing her voice to remain steady. Is this how you treat all potential customers, or just the ones who don't arrive draped in designer labels? Elaine's patience thinned visibly, her lips pressing into a taut line. We have the right to refuse service to anyone who does not meet our establishment standards. Hannah's jaw clenched. And what standards would those be exactly? Elaine's eyes flickered toward Hammond, who met her glance with a smug nod. The silent exchange spoke volumes. The message was clear. Valued customers were being disturbed. Thomas, Elaine called, her voice crisp. A young man in a suit, barely out of his 20s, stood near the entrance, his stance uncertain. Please escort this woman out. She's causing a disturbance. Thomas hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Ma'am, he said softly, stepping forward, his hand hovering near Hannah's elbow, but not daring to touch her. If you could please come with me. For a moment, Hannah considered arguing, considered demanding the basic respect she deserved. She could feel the weight of a dozen eyes watching, some reveling in the spectacle, others averting their gaze in discomfort. She could mention her husband's name. She could reveal exactly who she was. But before she could form the words, Elaine's smirk deepened. Let me guess, she said dryly. Your husband is someone very important? Hannah's breath caught. If you would just let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Victoria interjected coldly. The Crystal Palace has clear standards, and we are simply enforcing them. Hannah swallowed against the burning indignation rising in her throat. With as much dignity as she could gather, she allowed herself to be led toward the exit, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, Hammond let out a satisfied chuckle, his voice dripping with theatrical amusement. Finally, Some people are just too poor to stay. The words struck her like a slap, but she kept walking, forcing herself to lift her chin even as humiliation burned hot in her veins. As she stepped out into the night, the cold air did little to soothe the heat in her cheeks. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. This wasn't how she had planned to involve Michael in their anniversary surprise, but plans had changed. What she didn't know was that fate had already intervened. The distant hum of an engine sent a ripple through the night. Then from around the corner, sleek and unmistakable, a black Porsche 911 glided to a stop directly in front of the restaurant. The polished surface gleamed under the streetlights, an unspoken promise of power and presence. Hannah's heartbeat quickened. Inside the Crystal Palace, the evening continued undisturbed. Hammond was mid-story, his laughter carrying across the room. Victoria had returned to her post, her earlier triumph still gleaming in her eyes. Elaine was tending to another well-dressed couple, her demeanor once again exuding effortless authority. Then the front door opened. Victoria's professional smile appeared on reflex, only to freeze mid-expression. A tall man stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a midnight blue tuxedo, his presence commanding without effort. At 40, Michael Parker was a man who had nothing to prove. His success spoke for itself. His sharp eyes scanned the room, searching until they found Hannah outside the glass doors. Confusion flickered across his features for only a moment before his expression hardened into something far more dangerous. Victoria stepped forward, her voice smooth and practiced. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Crystal Palace. Do you have a reservation?" Michael turned to her, his voice even but edged with quiet authority. "I'm meeting my wife." Victoria's smile brightened, sensing an opportunity to salvage the moment. "Of course, sir. May I have the name on the reservation?" His gaze didn't waver. "Parker, Michael Parker." The effect was immediate. A barely perceptible tremor flickered through Victoria's demeanor. The name Parker carried weight in Boston's business elite. She recovered quickly, but the shift was there, the uncertainty creeping in. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice just a fraction less confident, "I don't believe we have a reservation under that name tonight." "That's because my wife came to make one," Michael replied, each word cutting with precision. "For our anniversary next week. But it seems she just stepped out." Victoria's face paled. "Your wife was here?" Michael's eyes narrowed. Blonde hair, beige cardigan. "Probably mentioned our anniversary." Silence. From his table, Hammond sat up, his interest piqued, sensing the shift in the air. Victoria stammered, "There may have been a misunderstanding." But Michael had already turned, stepping outside to where Hannah stood. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Everything all right?" Hannah took his hand, her fingers tightening around his. "Not exactly." Elaine, now acutely aware that something had gone terribly wrong, approached quickly. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her practiced smile faltering as she took in Michael's tailored tuxedo in undeniable presence. "Yes," Michael said calmly. "I understand my wife was just asked to leave your establishment." Elaine's composure cracked. "There must be some confusion." Michael's voice was ice. "I don't think so." He glanced at Hannah. "You were quite clear about your standards, weren't you?" A hush fell over the restaurant. Michael turned, his voice calm but unyielding. "Perhaps you should know who you just turned away. Hannah Parker, co-founder of the Parker Innovation Foundation, board member of the Boston Museum of Modern Art, and the woman who simply wanted to make a reservation at the place where we had our first date." Silence, and then everything shattered. The hush that fell over the restaurant was absolute. Even the faint clatter from the kitchen had ceased as staff peeked through the service doors, their curiosity overriding their tasks. At the front desk, Victoria stood frozen, the reservation book still open in her trembling hands. Elaine's professional mask had shattered, revealing a stark, uneasy expression. And yet, as Hannah looked around at their discomfort, she felt no victory, only sadness. How effortlessly people judge one another based on nothing but appearances. She turned to Michael, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay," she murmured. "Let's just go." But Michael wasn't done. His gaze remained locked on Hammond, who was now fidgeting in his chair. "Do you know what fascinates me, Mr. Hammond?" Michael's voice was calm, yet it carried through the heavy silence. "How often people mistake wealth for worth." A charged stillness held the Crystal Palace in its grip, every eye fixated on the tableau by the entrance. Hannah in her understated clothing, Michael in his immaculate tuxedo, and the restaurant staff, trapped in the weight of their own realization. Elaine cleared her throat, her voice stripped of its previous superiority. "Mr. Parker, please accept our sincerest apologies. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. We would be honored to seat you and Mrs. Parker immediately." Michael didn't move. His expression remained unreadable. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, the words heavy with meaning. "Is that what we're calling it?" Near the entrance, Thomas, the young host who had escorted Hannah out, looked visibly shaken. Unlike the others, his discomfort wasn't one of guilt alone. It was one of realization. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice steadier than even he expected. "Sir, Mrs. Parker did explain, several times. No one listened." Victoria shot him a sharp look, but he pressed on, conviction lending him strength. "She mentioned her husband, but you all cut her off." Hammond, unwilling to fade into irrelevance, pushed back his chair and stood. "Now see here. This woman was clearly underdressed for an establishment of this caliber. Rules exist for a reason." Michael turned, facing him fully. "And what do you believe determines a person's worth, Mr. Hammond?" Hammond blinked, caught off guard. "Well, obviously, certain standards must be upheld. People work hard to reach a certain position in life, and with that comes certain privileges." Michael's lips twitched, not in amusement, but in something far colder. "Interesting," he said evenly. "My wife works with children who have nothing. She teaches them art so they can express trauma they can't yet articulate. She helps direct millions in charitable funds to those who need it most. Her work is about substance, not appearances." Hannah's grip on Michael's arm tightened. This wasn't like him. He avoided scenes. He let his actions speak for themselves. And yet in this moment, seeing the fire in his eyes, she remembered why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "Michael," she whispered, "it's really okay." But he shook his head. "It's not okay, Hannah. Not just because of you, but because of how many others they've treated this way. People who didn't have the privilege to walk back in and prove their worth." Elaine took a step forward, desperation laced in her tone. "Mr. Parker, please, allow us to make this right. We can discuss this privately in my office." Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Make it right? You don't understand. This isn't about getting a table now that you know who we are. It's about the fact that you believe respect is something only some deserve." Uncomfortable whispers rippled through the diners. This was not the show they had anticipated with their lavish meals. This was a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of exclusivity. Across the room, an elderly woman in elegant attire rose from her seat. She walked slowly toward them, her presence commanding attention. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime in Boston's high society, "you are absolutely right." She turned to the staff. "My husband and I have dined here for 20 years. We've watched this place change from valuing character to valuing nothing but connections and appearances. Tonight confirms what we've long suspected." Her husband stood beside her. "We won't be returning." Hammond scoffed. "Now, Margaret, surely you're overreacting. Standards must be maintained or else what, Richard? Margaret's voice cut through his. We'd have to judge people by their character rather than their clothing. What a terrifying thought. Thomas, standing near the reception desk, slowly shrugged off his server's jacket. I quit, he announced. I've been uncomfortable with how we profile guests for months, but tonight was the last straw. Victoria's expression faltered completely. Thomas, don't be ridiculous. Think about your future. I am, he said simply, setting his jacket down. Hannah's chest tightened. She hadn't wanted this, hadn't intended to unravel lives or cause a scene, but perhaps this reckoning was long overdue. Michael, she murmured, let's go home. He nodded, sensing her exhaustion. As they turned to leave, Elaine made one last attempt. Mr. Parker, please, your anniversary reservation. We'd be honored to host you, complimentary, of course. Michael paused at the door, glancing back one final time. Our anniversary dinner was meant to celebrate love, growth, and values that matter. I'm afraid this place is incompatible with those. Outside, Hannah slipped her hand into Michael's. That was quite a scene. Too much? He asked, uncertain. She thought for a moment. Sometimes the world needs reminding that true worth isn't determined by appearance. From behind, a hesitant voice called out, Mr. and Mrs. Parker? They turned. Thomas stood there, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. I just wanted to say thank you for standing up, not just for Mrs. Parker, but for all the others who never had a voice. Michael smiled, extending his hand. Thank you for speaking the truth, Thomas. That takes real courage. Hannah studied him for a moment. Do you have any plans for dinner? No, ma'am. Then join us, she offered warmly. We know a little Italian place where they judge the food, not the guests. As the three of them walked away, the weight of the evening lifted. Behind them, through the restaurant's grand windows, Elaine was seen addressing her staff with urgent gestures. Victoria sat slumped at her station, and Hammond, the center of attention he had once craved, was now isolated in all the wrong ways. Some transformations happen in grand confrontations. Others unfold quietly over time. But all change begins with a choice, to see beyond the surface and recognize that true worth can never be measured by appearance alone.